Today we're going to look at Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. And it's important to realize that Edmund Burke was both a political practitioner as well as a political thinker. He is studied in the history of political thought, but was also a member of Parliament. And so unlike perhaps some of the philosophers that you may think of, such as Plato and Aristotle, he actually participated in the English political system. And while he was a supporter of the English Glorious Revolution as well as the American Revolution, which think of parliamentarians supporting the American Revolution, he was not a supporter of the French Revolution. And so this article is his explanation as why. And we're going to look at 6 points as to why he does not generally support the French Revolution and what his general view of politics are. First, I want you to look at the second paragraph where he notes, "I should therefore suspend my congratulations on the new liberty of France until I was informed of how it had been combined with government." And here we note that Burke is being very reflective. He is a supporter of liberty generally, but for him, liberty is not an end. He does not support any type of liberty. Rather, liberty is to be a means to something. And so he wants to ensure that liberty isn't taken to what we would call lasciviousness or license. He wants to, in fact, make sure that liberty is in pursuit of something good. So this is something to recognize that liberty is not to be an end of all political society, but is a means to a more specific thing, which he continues on of what those things are. With the collection of an effective and well-distributed revenue, with morality and religion, with solidity of property, with peace and order, with civil and social manners. All these, in their way, are good things too, and without them, liberty is not a benefit while it lasts, and not likely to continue long. And so Burke recognized, what are these things that liberty ought to pursue? Well, they ought to pursue some level of protection, peace, order, something that we call civility, social manners. And this is going to become important for him as he looks back on the reflection and the, quote, revolutionary progressive nature of the French Revolution. But he wants to ensure that liberty is used for good ends, and liberty is not something worthy in and of itself. Continuing on, Burke makes a reflection that I just want to bring your attention to in talking about kings. He notes at the paragraph 5, "Kings, in one sense, are undoubtedly the servants of the people because their power has no other rational end than that of the general advantage. But it is not true that they are, in the ordinary sense, anything like servants." And to our modern mind, it's a bit odd to be talking about kingship because obviously we do not live under, and we did have a revolt against the British monarchy. But there's something to be recognized that kings are not an inherently wrong type of political system. And the reason is, as Aristotle says in his Politics, that a way you tell a good regime from a bad regime is whether they are ruling for the sake of the people. And here, Edmund Burke fully recognizes that just because you have a king over you does not mean you should revolt against them, right? Going back to the French Revolution. Just because you have a king is not a horrible thing to live under. Rather, the question is that ruler, is that king looking out for your best interest? And it's important to realize he recognizes a hierarchical distinction that kings, though we call them our servants, they are not really the servants of the people. Yes, they are to look out for the good of the people, but it's not as if the people can always guide them, but rather you need to give the kings and the rulers some ability and some energy to go forward without constantly being questioned. And this actually leads to the next point that Burke, this is the third point that we're going to look at that Burke talks about, which is the role of equality. So if you look at paragraph 11 under what the subheading property, "In all societies consisting of various descriptions of citizens, some description must be uppermost. The levelers, therefore, only change and pervert the natural order of things." And this is a big critique he had of the French Revolution. For the French Revolution was really trying to abolish any sort of differences between rulers and people, really a heightened form of equality. And Burke is being very cautionary, saying you have to recognize that while there may be equality, equality does not mean a failure to recognize differences. There are legitimate differences both in wisdom, in property, in natural skills that people have. And in today's modern sense, we often call this the difference between equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. The French were much more in the equality of outcome, kind of trying to level everything where everyone owned the same things, everyone was treated exactly the same, and there was no difference between one man and another. Whereas equality of opportunity says we will all have the same opportunity to succeed with the various gifts that God has given us. He has given us our individual talents, and we will serve Him as He has given us desire and skill, and that may allow some people to ascend to different positions within society and even within the church, and that is perfectly acceptable. So this is what we'd call the equality of opportunity. But this leads Burke to talk about the concept of rule. If we have a system where we're seeking liberty, but liberty is important for its purpose, so it has to be a good liberty, and in which there is a legitimate part of kings or ruler for the sake of the people, how do we use this idea of equality to understand who ought to rule us? And this he goes into the second part of paragraph 11. Everything ought to be open, but not indifferently to every man. No rotation, no appointment by lot, no mode of election operating the spirit of sortition or rotation can be generally good in a government conversant in extensive objects. Burke's point here is that even though we have equality and support rule for the sake of the people, this does not mean everyone is equally a good ruler. We need to, in fact, allow people who have prudence. And so he talks a bit in many other places about the modes of how you set a form of government to ensure the people who come to rule are the ones who are wisest or most prudential. And this is also something our American founders spent much time discussing. So that's Burke's general comments on the French Revolution. But then he has some very specific comments that actually relate to politics generally and our modern view of politics. And this is under this section, the mechanistic view of society. And so I want to talk about 3 more points regarding this scientific or mechanistic view. And one of the reasons Burke was so against the French Revolution is because it is what we would call a progressive turn. Unlike the American Revolution and the British Revolution, which was an attempt to return to key principles that have been forgotten or lost or may have just been put aside, the French Revolution was very radical. I'm sure your readings have shown you some of the beheadings and just the way that these things are going on. And Burke's concern was that leaving your soil so quickly, leaving the background, the traditions that you've had, you are going to lose something. So in paragraph 16, he notes that upon pulling down an edifice which has answered in any tolerable degree for ages the common purposes of society, or in building it up again without having models and patterns of approved utility before the eyes, and he notes just before that, is with infinite caution that any man ought to venture this. And his argument is we need to ensure that we don't so quickly cast aside what could be collectively called the wisdom of the ancients or the experience of those who have come before us. While we should not blindly hold on to tradition or teachings without critical thought, it must be recognized that these traditions and these wisdoms have come from thoughtful people before us, and they have reached these conclusions with great thought and great information. So we should just not blindly cast aside. And we see this today, that there is a huge disrespect for history, for people of ancient ages even. We often see all the commercials that show the mistreatment of an elderly person because they're uncool or unhip. And this is kind of a tacit way of saying old things should be cast aside and all this progressively new stuff is the way to go. But Burke gives a great caution, as you have to recognize the wisdom that these historic and ancient things have had. And part of the reason this is important is really we're going to look at point 5, in paragraph 17. He says, the reason this wisdom of the ancients is so critical is because, quote, the nature of man is intricate. The objects of society are of the greatest possible complexity, and therefore no simple disposition or direction of power can be suitable either to man's nature or to the quality of affairs. Human life, human nature, both the individual and particularly when you put a bunch of individuals together collectively, is extraordinarily complex. And if you think about this, this is actually what you might say is an inherent flaw, and I use that word cautiously, of law. The flaw of law is that laws are general and cannot take into account every specific circumstance. And so they have to be made in ways that are general enough to give guidance without eliminating specific outcomes. And I'll give you an example. John Locke, who was a philosopher just prior to Edmund Burke, had written a book, The Two Treatises of Civil Government, in which he argued that laws are general and that it is necessary, therefore, for the executive to have something he calls prerogative power. For him, that means the ability to go around the law. And he gives an example. He says, if you live in a townhouse and your neighbor's house is burning, and while it's burning, it's perfectly acceptable for the firemen to come and break into your house in order to try to prevent the burning from going and even to take your property out of your house. Even though generally this would be breaking and entering and theft, in this specific circumstance, it's actually doing something that's helpful for you. They're breaking in and pulling all your stuff out so it doesn't catch fire. But a law can't distinguish between the rare events of when a house is on fire and the general events of when people break in to steal. And so the law has to say it's against the law to break into someone's house and take their property. And then we need to have judges and political people who are wise to say, well, in this circumstance, the law ought not apply because the principle that the law is talking about, the preservation of property, was the reason that the law was violated in this case. And so Burke is recognizing that you need to trust the wisdom of the ancients, this tradition, because they've thought through these generalities, these general systems of law. And yes, they may not see every circumstance. There might be points where you can critique them. Those are the rare events and not the specific points. And this leads Burke finally to the sixth point that I want to talk about today, to his critique of what we could say is modern political science. And as a political scientist, he is somewhat critiquing my profession. And he notes that since human nature is so complex, since laws are general, it is truly impossible to have a scientific precision in our ruling. And this he notes on paragraph 26. On the principles of this mechanic philosophy, our institutions can never be embodied. And this point is, you can never make a government scientific. The nature of humanity, the passions, the emotions that we have, are never able things that can be quantifiable scientific. And so while we may desire to have a perfect utopia in which everything is followed rationally through scientific processes, the reality is human nature is so much more complex than that. And so we may be sometimes stuck with generalities, and sometimes we may be even having disagreements over the specifics. But just because we disagree over the specifics does not mean that we ought to cast aside the general principles upon which they are based. And this is ultimately Burke's accusation against the French Revolution, that the French Revolution, unlike the American Revolution and unlike the British Revolution, did not return to fundamental principles, but was a novel establishment of new philosophies and new political ideas, and that in one sense, they were just a completely progressive change that no longer follows the wisdom of the ancients.